It would be true, wouldn't it, brothers and sisters, for all of us, that the greatest sign of the nearness of the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ has been the return of the Jewish people to the land and to the formation of the state of Israel. It's a notable sign of the times, and yet, in some ways, it's one of the most worrying, because although Israel is settled in her ancient land, we would be bound to acknowledge, in many respects even today, that they're far from secure, and that particularly the Palestinian problem seems to be a threat that just will never go away. And it's that subject of the Palestinian controversy that we want to examine by way of our biblical evidence tonight. And so, as our heading has rightly said, one of the dangers, of course, is to try and fit current events to Bible prophecy instead of doing it the other way around. The proper thing for us to do is to first establish a sound scriptural basis for our expectations, irrespective of what current events might or might not be doing or saying. And only when we've established a scriptural basis can we then examine what might be happening in the world today to see whether in fact it's consistent with what the scriptures declare shall be at the time of the end. In fact, just a word about prophetic applications that we have, I think, accepted largely as a community over time, because it's fundamentally sound, and that is an understanding amongst us that, firstly, not all prophecies require both a primary and a secondary fulfillment. Context and comparison need to be used before we decide automatically that a second or a latter-day application is warranted. And of course, in some cases it is, and in some cases there's good evidence for why we would say there's another application to come. But if that's the case, then we would see that that latter application would either relate to powers controlling the same territory, or to powers manifesting the same attributes as the power that once was there. And that where either or both of those coincide, then we have the basis for how we might determine a latter-day application. And it's also true to say, is it not, brothers and sisters, that there are clearly some prophecies which appear to have had no previous fulfillment, and the conclusion that we have is that their primary and only consummation lies, in fact, in the latter day. Perhaps there's only a handful of those, but there are some, and in some cases, perhaps some of the most famous. So our topic tonight has certainly got a biblical basis with regard to whether we're looking at primary or secondary fulfillments. Because the term Palestine or Palestinian is in fact a word derived from biblical origins. It's found in the word Palestina that we have in our authorized version. And the particular word, which is the Hebrew pelesheth, meaning rolling or migratory, is translated as Palestina 3 times, as Palestine once, as Philistia 3 times, and as Philistine once. So from a scriptural perspective, what we would say is that a Palestinian is effectively a Philistine, because they control the same territory as the Philistines of old, and they also manifest the same attributes as the Philistines of old. So here's one of those examples where on both counts we might argue a latter-day application, both in terms of territory and spirit. The Palestinians of today show certain remarkable similarities with the Philistines of the past. In fact, the Arabic term for Palestine liberation is Tahrir Philistin, and you can see there the connection of thought with the Philistines of old. Now, having said that, it's important to note that from a biblical basis, although we see that the Palestinians of the present are on the same territory as the Philistines of old, and may show the same spirit as the Philistines of old, that they're not actual descendants of the Philistines in any way. They've got no ethnic or linguistic or cultural connection whatsoever. In fact, the Philistines of the Old Testament era are completely gone. They're completely gone because the Bible said they would go, and that Bible set of prophecies was fulfilled. So the story of the modern-day Palestinians in the region of Palestine is that somehow this is an ancient people on an ancient homeland is a media fraud that has been perpetrated by the Palestinians themselves. There was never a separate Palestinian nation living in Palestine itself. There's been Arabs living in Palestine, but in fact a very large influx of Arabs who moved into Palestine before 1948 came, not because they were Palestinians, they came from Tunisia and Morocco and Lebanon and other places, but they came in fact because of commerce and employment opportunities in the land of Palestine. But there was no such thing as a Palestinian nation. In fact, you might be interested to know that in 1948, after the War of Independence and when certain Palestinians did flee from the land, the United Nations Relief Organization had to basically come up with a definition of who they would categorize as a Palestinian refugee, because they were going to grant refugee status to them and they were going to grant refugee assistance. So the definition was, well, if they've lived in Palestine for 24 months, they're a Palestinian. They're a Palestinian refugee. They might have come from Syria or Iraq. They might have moved to Palestine only a couple of years ago, but they're now Palestinian refugees, cruelly torn from their ancient homeland that they've been living in for almost 2 years. This is not to say that there weren't Arabs who lived in Palestine and that some of those Arabs lived there for centuries. But you see, there were also Jews who'd lived there for centuries. And if it was a matter of primacy of claim, in terms of whether Arab stock or Jewish stock might have primary claim to the land on the basis of longevity of involvement with that land, then the Jewish claim would certainly be as strong, would it not, as the Palestinian claim? I think so. Here's the reality. There is no Palestinian history, there is no Palestinian language, there is no Palestinian culture, there is no Palestinian identity. They were Arabs living in mandated Palestine, as were many Jews. In fact, up until 1948, the term Palestinian always referred to a Jew living in Palestine. And here's another interesting thing. From 1948 to 1967, the West Bank and the city of Jerusalem were controlled by Jordan. And yet during that Jordanian occupation of the area, no Palestinian entity asked for their ancient homeland back. They only discovered that they were a people after Israel took control of that area in 1967. Well, let's start with a biblical examination, shall we? And try and come to what at least we think is a Bible perspective on the matter. If you come back to the book of Exodus and chapter 15, there's an interesting prophecy there about the time when, under Moses, the children of Israel were first going to march into the land of Israel, as it later became known. And the record tells us in Exodus chapter 15, verse 14, it says, "The people shall hear and be afraid. Sorrow shall take hold on the inhabitants of Palestina." There's that Hebrew word, Pelasheth. The inhabitants of Palestina. "Then shall the dukes of Edom be amazed, the mighty men of Moab. Trembling shall take hold upon them. All the inhabitants of Canaan shall melt away. Fear and dread shall fall upon them by the greatness of thine arm. They shall be as still as a stone till thy people pass over, O Yahweh, till the people pass over, which thou hast purchased." And so we're told here that Palestina was among those who trembled at the news of Israel's march out of Egypt, because the territory on which they dwelt was part of the land promised by God to Israel. And I think there's a clue here, incidentally, in Exodus chapter 15, as to where Palestina might have been. Because just notice again what the record says here in the Exodus 15 record. It refers to Palestina, it refers to Edom, it refers to Moab, and it refers to Canaan. And I think what we've got here, you see, is a set of nations referred to, all the ones that would tremble as Israel came marching into the land. And Palestina was a power that lay to the west of the land, you see. It was on the coast. That's where Palestina of Old Testament times was. And we know that because of another passage, which we shan't turn up, but we'll put it on screen. In the days of the conquest, in the time of Joshua, we're told this in Joshua chapter 13. It says in verses 2 and 3 there, "This is the land that yet remaineth, all the borders of the Philistines, the Palestinians, 5 lords of them, the Gazathites and the Ashdothites and the Escalonites and the Gittites and the Ekronites." So you see, there it is, you see, we had 5 cities of the Philistines in Old Testament times. The city of Gaza, the city of Ashdod, the city of Ashkelon, the city of Gath, and the city of Ekron. These were the 5 lords of the Philistines. And so what we would have to say is that prophetically, from an Old Testament perspective, that's where Palestina was. They were on the coast, you see. And although this part of the land was promised by God to Israel, they never managed to totally conquer it. And so Palestina remained a pricking briar or a piercing thorn in Israel's side. They were always at enmity with Israel. Israel only enjoyed times of peace when the Palestinians were defeated or subdued. But the trouble is, Israel didn't have the faith to subdue them completely. And that controversy began in Joshua's time and lasted for a long time afterwards. In fact, let me just give you 2 illustrations of how that controversy and how that enmity perpetuated itself down through time. If you come to Psalm 108, we've got the time of David. Here's a psalm written by David which makes reference to this fact. There was enmity between Israel and Palestina, not just in the time of Joshua, but now we've come right through to the time of King David. And yet that enmity is still there, as the record will tell us. Psalm 108 says this in the 7th verse. It says, "God hath spoken in his holiness." Now, incidentally, that phrase, "God hath spoken in his holiness," we believe is a reference to the promise made to David in the 2nd of Samuel chapter 7. Do you remember? The great covenant promise. The promise was that God would plant Israel to dwell in a place of their own. And that promise also said that God would bring them rest by subduing all their enemies. And so David, in writing this psalm, looks forward to the time when the promise of the covenant would be fulfilled. Verse 7, "God hath spoken in his holiness, I will rejoice, I will divide Shechem, I will mete out the valley of Succoth. Gilead is mine, Manasseh is mine." Oh, did you notice, brothers and sisters, that's both sides of Jordan, you realise, in that language? Both sides of Jordan is treated as part of the land that would be promised by divine authority to Israel. And then it says, verse 8, "Ephraim is the strength of my head, Judah is my lawgiver, Moab is my washpot, over Edom will I cast out my shoe, over Philistia will I triumph." But that word Philistia there is the word Pelesheth again. "Over Palestina will I triumph." The very nations referred to in Exodus chapter 15, as Moses sings his song. And here it is still in the days of David, but David looked forward, you see, to battles of victory against those enemies of Israel in the land. Now, we know that came to pass because if you come back to the 1st of Chronicles chapter 18, just as David spoke prophetically of this in his song, so literally he in fact won victories against all of those places. Here's the historical record now. Psalm 108 is the poetical account, but the 1st of Chronicles 18 is the historical record. And 1st of Chronicles chapter 18 verse 1 says, "Now after this it came to pass," after what? After the covenant promise of the previous chapter, it came to pass that David smote the Philistines and subdued them and took Gath and her towns out of the hand of the Philistines. And he smote Moab, and the Moabites became David's servants and brought gifts. So David waged this campaign on the strength of God's promise to him when he spoke in his holiness. It's long after the time of Joshua, but there was in measure a settling of the controversy between Israel and Palestine in the times of King David. And so also in the time of King Hezekiah, because if you come to the book of Isaiah in chapter 14, and now we come even further on in time, from David right through to the time of King Hezekiah, the same controversy existed in later times. Isaiah chapter 14, you might know at the end of that chapter, has a final burden in the last few verses, beginning, we believe, in verse 28. The record says in Isaiah 14 verse 28, in the year that King Ahaz died was this burden. And that the burden that's referred to there is the passage that follows from verses 29 to 32. It was proclaimed at the time that Hezekiah came to the throne, and it relates to the circumstances of his reign. So this is what the burden was, and this is what the burden said. Verse 29, rejoice not thou, whole Palestina, because the rod of him that smote thee is broken. For out of the serpent's root shall come forth a cockatrice, and his fruit shall be a fiery flying serpent. You see, in the days of Uzziah, he had subdued the Philistines during his reign. 2 Chronicles chapter 26 tells us that. But Ahaz, his grandson, was a weak king. And during Ahaz's reign, we're told that the Philistines recovered some of their cities, says 2 Chronicles 28. But what the prophet Isaiah was saying here was that if Palestina was expecting further respite after the death of Ahaz, they would be disappointed. Because Hezekiah, who sprang from Ahaz, would prove to be a far more formidable foe than his father, and he would be a viper to the whole region of Palestina, as the record says. Howl, verse 31, O gate, cry, O city, thou whole Palestina art dissolved. Oh yes, this was a promise in the days of Hezekiah, that judgment again would come upon the nation of Palestina. Now, did that come to pass? Most certainly, because if you come back to the 2nd of Kings and chapter 18, as that may be the poetical record by prophecy in Isaiah, so we have the historical account in the 2nd of Kings chapter 18 and verse 1. It came to pass, just so. In fact, you'll notice what it says in 2 Kings 18 verse 1. It says, now it came to pass in the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. What year did Hezekiah begin to reign? Well, 2 of Kings chapter 16 verse 20 says, and Ahaz slept with his fathers, and Hezekiah his son reigned in his stead. In the year that King Ahaz died was this burden, you see, is what Isaiah chapter 14 had said. And so it would come to pass in this chapter as Hezekiah takes the throne. And so verse 7 says, 2 Kings 18, and Yahweh was with him, and he prospered whithersoever he went forth, and he rebelled against the king of Assyria and served him not, and he smote the Philistines, even unto Gaza, and the borders thereof, from the tower of the watchman to the fenced city. So the burden of Isaiah 14 was fulfilled, you see. Hezekiah did smite the region of the Philistines, including the city of Gaza itself, unto the borders thereof. So you see, what we've got here in those two little examples is an illustration of a controversy that began in the time of Moses, was there in the time of David, it's there in the time of Hezekiah. What we've got is a continuing spirit of conflict between Israel and Palestina. And ultimately, God decreed judgment against Palestina because of that unrelenting hostility against his people. It's really Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3, isn't it? I will curse him that curseth thee. You cannot touch God's people with impunity. And so eventually, because of that spirit, the power of Palestina was judged. Now, we don't have time to look at the prophecies of judgment, but again, let me just illustrate them on screen so that we can see in fact what happened. Because there was a series of judgments decreed upon Palestina because of their spirit of unrelenting hostility towards Israel. Well, it was one in Amos chapter 1 that's fulfilled in the days of Pharaoh Necho of Egypt. There's another prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 47 that was likewise fulfilled by Pharaoh Necho of Egypt. There's a prophecy against Palestine in Ezekiel 25 that was fulfilled by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. There's one in Zechariah chapter 9 that was fulfilled by Alexander of Greece. And there's another one in Zephaniah chapter 2 that was fulfilled by Judas Maccabeus. So there's a whole cascade of prophecies against the power of Palestina, every one of which came to pass. Now, let's look at one of these, just by way of example. Perhaps if we take the one in the middle, Ezekiel chapter 25, and I just draw your attention to a couple of parts in that prophecy that are relevant for purposes of our analysis tonight. In Ezekiel 25, here's one of those typical prophecies of judgment that were decreed against the power of Palestina. And notice what the record says. Ezekiel 25, verses 15 and 16. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, because the Philistines, the Palestinians of the day, have dealt by revenge and have taken vengeance with a despiteful heart to destroy it for the old hatred. Therefore thus saith the Lord Yahweh, behold, I will stretch out mine hand upon the Philistines, and I will cut off the Cherithim and destroy the remnant of the sea coast. Now you see that phrase, the old hatred, in verse 15. The old hatred, that's Ebya Olam. The American Standard Bible says, because of the perpetual enmity. The Revised Standard Version says, because of the never-ending enmity. You see, this was a hostility that would never go away. And eventually God would permit it no longer. And he stretched out his hand in judgment against Palestina. Oh, and where did that judgment come? Over what was his hand stretched? Well, verse 16 says, over the remnant of the sea coast. Because that's, you see, where Palestina was. And by the time all of those judgments and all of those prophecies were fulfilled, the Philistines were gone from the earth, extinguished under the judgments of God. So you see, the question is, do we expect to see a Jewish-Palestinian conflict in the latter days? In other words, do we expect to see a revival not only of Israel, but also of the Philistines or the Palestinians, and a resumption of their hostilities in the latter days? And I think the answer to that question must be, brothers and sisters, why, yes. So let's just piece together two or three prophecies that I think are helpful in that regard, concerning what we might describe as the future revival of Palestina. Well, the first one is to be found in Psalm 83. We're not going to look at Psalm 83 in any detail. I just draw your attention again to one particular idea, but so that it's clear, most psalms have some sort of historical fulfillment, and I certainly think that Psalm 83 has one. I know that this psalm is sometimes taken as evidence that there'll be a Jewish-Arab battle as the cause célèbre of the latter days, and the whole story of Bible prophecy is the Jew versus the Arab. Well, firstly, I don't think that's what Bible prophecy is about fundamentally at all. I think it's got nothing to do with the framework of Bible prophecy. But it's not to say that there may not be another Jewish-Arab battle. Why, there's been a whole handful of them, hasn't there, since Israel's been back in the land. But what Psalm 83 does suggest, if there is a future fulfillment of them, is that even if there is a battle, it's not going to result in a terrible defeat for Israel, as sometimes the psalm is pressed to try and do service to. I think Psalm 83 has certainly historical connections. Verse 5 mentions a confederacy, and that large confederacy is found in 2 Chronicles 20, verse 2, verse 12, verse 15, in the days of Jehoshaphat. Verse 8 says at the end of the verse that confederacy was led by the children of Lot. And 2 Chronicles chapter 20 verse 1, 10, 22 and 23 all say that the battle of that time was led by the children of Lot. Psalm 83 verse 12 says that the spirit of those was, let us take to ourselves the houses of God in possession. And that spirit was found in the confederacy of the 2nd of Chronicles chapter 20 and verse 11. And at the end of the psalm, it will it not, verse 18 clearly indicate the possibility of a marvellous victory for, well, not for the confederacy, but for Israel. Verse 18, that men may know that thou, whose name alone is Yahweh, art the Most High over all the earth. And that amazing victory is recorded for us in the 2nd of Chronicles chapter 20, verses 27 to 30. Is it not? The amazing victory in the days of Jehoshaphat. So here's the thing, brothers and sisters. If there is a latter-day application of this psalm, then we could certainly argue that it suggests an Arab-Israeli conflict. And we can certainly argue verse 7, because here's the critical verse for our purposes, is that it might involve Gebal and Ammon and Amalek and the Philistines. But that word Philistines there is again the word Pelesheth. It should be rendered Palestina. So this psalm doesn't predict a catastrophic defeat of Israel. If anything, it implies a possible brilliant victory for Israel, but that there might yet be some controversy with surrounding powers, one of whom is the Palestina mentioned here in verse 7. And may I just noticed for your interest in passing that in that same verse there's a connection with Tyre. Now Tyre, of course, is the territory of Lebanon that takes us to the area that's currently in the grip of Hezbollah, who manifest the same hostility against Israel as does Hamas in Gaza. Our second reference is in the book of Obadiah. And Obadiah, of course, whatever past and historical fulfillment it holds, does seem to have some latter-day application because of the language of the prophecy at the conclusion. So this is what Obadiah says. Obadiah, and perhaps reading firstly verse 17 and then verses 19 to 20. So Obadiah verse 17 says, upon Mount Zion shall be deliverance, and there shall be holiness, and the house of Jacob shall possess their possessions. Well, of course, the ultimate fulfillment of that verse has not yet occurred. And before it does, we're told this in just reading perhaps verse 19. They of the south shall possess the mount of Esau, and they of the plain, the Philistines. So you see, it's not just a territory that will be possessed, not just the plain of the Philistines. No, it's the Philistines living there. It's the territory of Palestina, but it's also the people living there. Or not only that, but verse 20 says that they'll possess it even unto Zarephath. Now, Zarephath lies directly between Tyre and Sidon on the coast of Lebanon. So that's just something for us to note, because we're going to come back to that a little while later on. So what we've got here in the prophecy of Obadiah is that in any final application of the prophecy, there is the matter of the Palestinians that dwell in the ancient plain of Palestina that one day will come under the control of the nation of Israel. Well, our reader read for us from the book of Joel. And in Joel chapter 3, and likewise, we're not talking about the historical basis for the book, but the final fulfillment yet to come, because as a community we've always believed in a latter-day application, of course, in Joel chapter 3, because as the chapter comes to a marvellous end, we know that the resolution will be when Yahweh shall roar out of Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem, and that the fullness of Amos 3, yet await of Joel 3 rather, yet awaits a fulfillment still to come. Now let's read Joel 3 and perhaps verses 2 to 4. I'll gather all nations, bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, plead with them there for my people, for my heritage Israel, whom they've scattered. They've cast lots for my people, and given a boy for an harlot, and sold a girl for wine that they may drink. Yea, and what have ye to do with me, O Tyre and Sidon, and all the coasts of Palestina? Will ye render me a recompense? And if ye recompense me, swiftly and speedily will I return your recompense upon your own head. So you see, the recompense of God upon Palestina is clearly in retribution for their recompense of their evil to God. And presumably, brothers and sisters, God's recompense, God's judgment upon Palestina in Joel chapter 3 and verse 4, in the latter days, can only be outworked if there are Palestinians in Palestina upon whom a recompense can be visited. And where exactly are they? They're in the coasts of Palestine. So you see, what we're being told here is that there are Palestinians at the time of the end on the coast, yet awaiting a judgment that's yet to come. And who are they in collusion with? Well, the verse says, the inhabitants of Tyre, Psalm 83, those that go even unto Zarephath, Obadiah 19, Tyre and Sidon, Joel chapter 3. So you see, what we've got here, which is something rather interesting, is that when we look at those markers, those place names, you can smell the smell of the sea in these verses, can you not? And the significance of that seaside air will become of relevance as our story of Palestina unfolds. Now, just one more passage, Isaiah chapter 11. And Isaiah 11, of course, makes mention, in effect, of, we believe, the same circumstances and finally of the same judgment yet to come. Because Isaiah 11 ultimately is the time of the planting of the ensign. That's what Isaiah 11 verse 10 says. In that day there shall be a root of Jesse which shall stand for an ensign of the people. So this is the time, this chapter is the time of the planting of the ensign, but it's also the time of the reconciliation of the two branches of Israel. Verse 13 says, the envy of Ephraim shall depart, and the adversaries of Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not envy Judah, and Judah shall not vex Ephraim. And when all that happens, that time, verse 14 says, that Israel will fly upon the shoulders of the Philistine toward the west. Now, brothers and sisters, Israel in that day can only fly upon the shoulders of the Philistines to the west if there is a Palestina in the west to fly upon. So again, it argues that at the time of the end, we look to see a fulfillment of things in the land, of events and circumstances in the land that clearly indicate to us that Palestina is going to be revived and upon her ancient territory in the latter days. It's in the weight of the passages brought together and the commonality of the themes, of course, that we find the conviction of Scripture. Some of you may know, rather interestingly, that the Oslo Peace Accords nominated Gaza as the proposed capital of any future Palestinian state. Gaza. What an interesting name and what an interesting place to propose. The very name drawn from one of the 5 cities of the Philistines of old, and there is right in the land today, under that same ancient name, and it was that place that was proposed as a possible capital for a Palestinian state. And you see, here's the thing. They're not just controlling the same territory, these Palestinians of today, with the Philistines of yesterday. They're most certainly manifesting the same attributes, are they not? Because consider, here's the ancient enmity of Palestina as we saw it in Ezekiel chapter 25. Ezekiel 25 says, because the Philistines have dealt by revenge and have taken vengeance with a despiteful heart to destroy with perpetual hatred. You see, that's the ancient enmity of Palestina in past times. Do you think that spirit's there today in the modern Palestinian in that place? Why, yes. Here's a couple of quotations from Ismail Haniyeh, who is a senior leader of Hamas, which of course control the area of the Gaza Strip. Two quotations from this Hamas leader. "We repeat today that we are with the establishment of a Palestinian state on any liberated part of Palestinian land that is agreed upon by the Palestinian people without recognizing Israel or conceding any inch of historical Palestine." Sounds like an easy sort of person to negotiate with, don't you think, in terms of a peace treaty between the two nations? It's all very well, of course, for other nations to say to Israel, you should be at peace with the Palestinians. How do you negotiate with someone who will not recognize your right to exist? Well, here's another one. Palestine is from the sea to the river, from Rosh Hanikra to Rafah, which happens to be, incidentally, in case you didn't know, the full extent of present Israel. That's all Palestine belongs to the Palestinians. We will not recognize Israel. Would you say that that's the spirit of ancient Palestina? I think so. Alive and well today in the Palestinians, you see. Oh yes, there's a latter-day revival, don't you think? Consider the events of 2005 when Israel decided to leave Gaza entirely. And I think one of the reasons why they did so was to say, all right, we will withdraw. So they did. They relinquished control of the Gaza Strip. They withdrew all Israelis, they closed all Jewish settlements, they removed all military personnel, and they handed over responsibility to the PLO for self-government. And in a way, it was really a test for the world to view. Here you are, it's yours. You can run it. Now, demonstrate that you can be a good neighbour with Israel. So there was a PLO election. But it brought a dramatic result because Hamas was elected to government. And Hamas are committed to the old battle cry, no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiation with Israel. In fact, in their charter, they have an openly stated intention to destroy Israel. So there was a brutal internal battle for control of Gaza, which, by the way, was Arab against Arab, nothing to do with Israel. It ended with the complete rout of Fatah and with Hamas taking total control of the Gaza Strip. And on the day that they took control, Israel declared the Gaza Strip to be a hostile entity. I rather think, brothers and sisters, that if we had a little nation right next door to us in Nottingham, we might declare them to be a hostile entity as well, if their fundamental charter was no recognition of Nottingham and death to Nottingham. Don't you think? And who's funding Hamas? Well, the same money that flows through Syria from Iran, the same channel that supports and equips Hezbollah in Lebanon. Did I say Lebanon? I should have said Tyre and Sidon, shouldn't I? Because that's the biblical language to describe that place. And you see, there's a religious imperative behind the association of Hezbollah in Tyre and Sidon and the Palestinians in Gaza. And it's the Shiite doctrine of the reappearance of the 12th Imam, which Shiite Muslims believe is the prerequisite for a new and golden age of Muslim dominance. But the return of that hidden one is critically linked to the destruction of Israel. It's in their statement of faith. Shiites are doctrinally committed to the destruction of Israel. And Hamas in Gaza is being encouraged to establish what's really a Shiite enclave in a Sunni area. So given that Israel is seen to be dwelling in safety when Gog invades the land, how do we imagine that that safety might occur? By a peaceful negotiation with Palestine? Or by a military confrontation? What thinkest thou? What's the most likely of those two options? Well, I think that the setting of Scripture would tell us that when Gog invades, there won't be peace in this region. And there's a biblical reason why we suggest that such a peace treaty will never be negotiated with the Palestinians. from a biblical perspective. Here's the history of what really happened in biblical times. We're just going to look at the references on the screen, but in each case you'll notice the key word. First of Chronicles chapter 18 verse 1 says, it came to pass that David smote the Philistines and subdued them and took Gath and her towns. First of Kings chapter 4 says, Solomon reigned over all the kingdoms from the river unto the land of the Philistines, for he had dominion even unto Gaza. Second of Chronicles chapter 17 says, and the fear of the Lord fell upon all the kingdoms, and also the Palestinians, the Philistines, brought Jehoshaphat tribute silver. Second Chronicles chapter 26 says, and he, Uzziah, went forth and warred against the Philistines and brake down the wall of Gath and built cities about Ashdod. And 2 Kings chapter 18 says, Hezekiah smote the Philistines even unto Gaza and the borders thereof. You see, what we're being told from a biblical perspective is that the kings of Israel had political alliances, but they never negotiated a peace treaty with Palestine. Peace only ever came to Israel through the subduing of Palestine. And I think that what these passages indicate is that whatever peace there might be in the land when Gog comes, it's much more likely to have been because of some dramatic confrontation, some dramatic act perhaps of Hamas hostility that triggers an Israeli reprisal after the manner and with the same success as David or Solomon or Jehoshaphat or Uzziah or Hezekiah of old, and Palestine will be subdued. That's the only way peace will come. Certainly from a biblical perspective, that's what we would believe. And just as various Arab nations cooperated with the great northern invaders of the past, so we believe that Palestine will become the ally of Gog in the future. And how that will be revealed and how that will occur is the substance of several very interesting Bible prophecies. Let's just tabulate some of those, again for lack of time, on the screen. Do you remember what Zechariah chapter 12 says? Zechariah chapter 14 rather. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and half the city shall go forth into captivity. That there's going to be such a terrible circumstance here in the battles yet to emerge, where part of the Israelitish population, part of the Jewish population, will be taken away from the land, is the promise of Zechariah chapter 14. So, where do you think the Jews might be deported from? Well, let's ship them out, shall we? Well, where might they ship them from? Well, from the coastal ports. Wouldn't you say that's where ships go from? And the answer is yes. And isn't that the force of Joel chapter 3? Yea, and what have you to do with me, O Tyre and Sidon, and all the coasts of Palestina? The children of Judah have ye sold unto the Grecians. So note now the significance of these expressions. Tyre and Sidon, all the coasts of Palestina, the selling of the children of Judah. So Judah refers to those already in the land at the coming of Christ. This is about Jewish deportations. There's treachery afoot here in these passages. And it's the treachery of Palestina, which really is exactly what Isaiah 11 says, you see. Why would there be a gathering together of the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth if they're already supposed to be back in the land? And the answer is because some of them have been deported. Some of Judah have been sent back out into captivity. Some are still to be regathered after the consequence of what's happened. At the time the ensign is planted in the land, there'll be a recovery even of the dispersed of Judah. And Isaiah 11 says that no sooner are they back in the land than they fly upon the shoulders of the Palestinians to the west. Why do you think they might just do that when they return? I wonder. Because there's going to be clearly some deportations. And we believe that the Palestinians are going to be complicit in that matter. In fact, I think we can be even more certain about the association of Palestina in Scripture with the sea coast, because that's the connection, you see. All those prophecies about the coast will reach their climax in the deportation of Jews from that coastal region. I think we've got some history, you see, to demonstrate that. Because going back to AD 132, in the time of Emperor Hadrian, we understand that he sent several 100,000 slaves by ships to the slave markets of Egypt. In fact, it was so bad, the number of Jews that he sent away, that when they got there, they couldn't sell them all. They couldn't sell them all because there were too many Jewish slaves packed off by ship to Egypt, which incidentally fulfilled this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 28, when the last verse says that Yahweh shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, and there shall ye be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen. But the verse goes on to say that they wouldn't all be sold. The reason is they couldn't sell them all. There were so many of them. Now, why that's interesting is that those deportations all took place from Hadrian's slave market, and you'd never guess where his slave market was, would you? It was, in Gaza, on the sea coast. That's where those deportations occurred. So what an interesting foreshadowing of possible future developments. Imagine the work of the angels right now in terms of this sequence of events for things yet to come and already established on the coast in the region of Palestine of old. In fact, let me show you something about seaports of Palestine. Some time ago, almost 15 years ago, this article occurred in the Christadelphian. It was in the Signs of the Times section in April 2005. It says, an agreement has been reached to allow the Palestinians to rebuild their port just south of Gaza City, not far from where the settlement of Netzarim once stood. The port is being seen as a symbol of Palestinian independence and as their economic gateway to the world. So you see, there was going to be a port in Gaza. Well, at least it was announced. The trouble was that when Hamas took control, Israel decided it might not be a good idea to actually have a Gaza port facility just at the moment, and so that port never got built. In fact, it still hasn't. But you know, there's at least 5 options on the table right now for how that Gaza seaport might be constructed. And there's debate going on about that right now in the Israeli parliament as to whether that might still be a good idea for certain geopolitical reasons. Well, we would be watching with great interest, wouldn't we, to see a seaport facility in Palestine in terms of what we expect of coming Bible prophetic events in that region. But what you might not know is that the largest Israeli port is based in Ashdod, just up the road. That's a deep water port. It's their major cargo and also their major passenger facilities, known as the Gate to Jerusalem. It's the place where most shipping comes in and out of Israel. Can you just imagine, brothers and sisters, in the time when Gog comes down, with what glee the Palestinians would seek to cooperate with Gog in deporting Jewish people from the land, not only in the port of Gaza, should it be built in time, but by commandeering the Israeli port of Ashdod, where there's plenty of room to bring the biggest boats in to ship as many people out as they can. The scene is being set right now for the controversy of the invasion of the Middle East at the time of the end, you see. So what are our latter-day expectations then as these developments unfold? Well, I think it would be reasonable from what we've seen tonight to believe that from Isaiah 11 and Joel chapter 3 that there will be an increasing level of strong and independent Palestinian activity centred primarily upon the coastal region of Gaza. If there was to be a Palestinian state at the time of the end, surely this is where we would expect it to be from a biblical perspective. And not only that, but from Psalm 83 and from Ezekiel 25, no doubt we will see a continued relentless drive from the Palestinians based in Gaza to foment a continuous state of enmity against Israel. And perhaps we might also see, as the Israeli politicians become more aware of the importance of Scripture, they might learn that security against the Palestinians in Gaza is never going to come by a peace treaty, but only by some form of military control, just as the kings of Israel and Judah did in times past. It's remarkable, really, when you think about it, brothers and sisters, but how privileged we are to see such powerful developments in the land which confirm our faith in prophetic Scripture. You see, we have nothing to be frightened of or to be fearful of as the men and women of the book. You can understand how people in the world have no idea what's going on or where it will go or how it will work out. But as Christadelphians, we say, we expected that to happen. That's what the Bible says. The Bible's always written tomorrow's newspapers long ago. We're the only ones that read those newspapers, brothers and sisters. We know. We're privileged to know. And because we know, we have absolute confidence, not only that it will all work out, but that actually there's only one solution, and there always only has been one solution to an otherwise intractable problem, and that's this, that those very prophecies that we've looked at tonight, the prophecy of Obadiah, the prophecy of Joel, the prophecy of Isaiah, are really prophecies that tell us how Palestina is itself a signal for the imminent return of our Lord Jesus Christ. Saviours will come up on Mount Zion, says Obadiah. A voice shall roar in Jerusalem, says Joel. An ensign shall be set up in the land, says Isaiah. Aren't these all indicators of the coming of Christ? All pointers to the fact that Christ is the one, the only one that can come to solve these particular problems. Only an immortal adjudicator with infallible insight and unlimited powers can bring about a resolution to this crisis. None other. But then we've always known that, haven't we, brothers and sisters? We've got to live our lives in expectation that only the coming of Christ is the answer to every problem in life, not just the Palestinian one, but all the problems of the world. And that we who are the people of the book, we're not here to solve the problems of the world. We're not here to tackle the social welfare of the world. We're not here to achieve the peace of the world, or even to save the rainforests. God will sort all of that out via his Son in due time. Our task, our role, as a separate community of pilgrims and strangers, is to wait for the coming of the one promised in these places, in these passages, and that when he comes, Israel will be saved. And because Israel will be saved, the whole world will find peace. As one of our hymns says, "O happy day when wars shall cease, and ransomed earth be filled with peace, when sin and death no more shall reign, and Eden bloom on earth again."